How are surgical instruments made? Well, when a mommy instrument and a daddy instrument come together. These sterile processing professionals, Brandon the Sterile Guy here. In today's video, we're going to talk about how surgical instruments are made. Before we jump in, please subscribe to the channel. I don't want you to miss any future videos, and make sure you get those notifications when I drop a new video every week. So how are surgical instruments made? Well, it's actually a pretty simple process and much more straightforward than people might think it is. The biggest challenge up front is knowing what materials are used and why. So most surgical instruments are made with stainless steel, but which type of stainless steel is used is very important. The two common types are austenitic and martensitic. I know, not the easiest to remember, let alone pronounce. But let's talk about austenitic stainless steel first. This is also known as 300 series stainless steel. This stainless steel is much more malleable than we'll talk about for the next stainless steel. This steel is used most commonly in instruments like, yeah, you guessed it, the malleable retractor, or something like a Fraser suction. I am sure you've got sets back with Fraser suctions that have been all bent in different ways. That is stainless steel 300. This type of stainless steel can have bends and folds without compromising the integrity of the stainless steel itself. Now, the other type of stainless steel is called martensitic, which is a 400 series stainless steel. This stainless steel is much harder and has very little flexibility. This metal tolerates a lot more stress, which is why it can be formed into cutting edges, like the cutting edges of scissors or the cutting edges of gouges and osteotomes. And they're able to be used for cutting or chiseling or whatever it is you use them for without bending and being flexible where it's not performing the job it's intended for. The 400 series is also found in a lot of other instruments like Richardson retractor, Army Navy retractor, a lot of different forceps, things that cannot be flexible. They need to serve the purpose that they were designed for, which means they need to be strong and not flexible. Now, another metal that you're gonna see used in surgical instruments is called tungsten carbide. You might have heard of tungsten carbide needle holders, tungsten carbide scissors. Tungsten carbide is one of the highest quality metals you can find in surgical instruments and is actually stronger than stainless steel. Tungsten carbide scissors will also retain the sharpness much longer than, say, a 400 stainless steel. And then you'll find a lot of different instruments that are actually made up of stainless steel and tungsten carbide, and the tungsten carbide portion is the area of the instrument that you can actually replace down the road with new tungsten carbide like scissor tips or things like that. Tungsten carbide, of course, is much more expensive than stainless steel, which is why you find it more rarely. And it wouldn't be a successful business model if they didn't offer you tiers of quality, right? Okay, so that is the basic metals that are used in surgical instruments. But the question remains, how are surgical instruments made? Well, the very first step in creating surgical instruments is called forging. This is where metal is heated until it becomes a liquid, and then it is poured into molds to create the general shape of what we're trying to create. This is just like when gold is melted down and it's poured into those big bar things, like the gold you think of when you think of Fort Knox. So after forging, when the instruments have cooled and they've taken on that shape, the very next thing is milling. Milling is the process of removing all the excess material and jagged edges from the edges of the mold. So milling is a pretty extensive process, and not only does it remove the unwanted metal from the instruments themselves, it actually helps start forming the shape and the characteristics of the surgical instrument you're going to be making, such as like serrations. The next step in the process is called tempering. Now, people who are much smarter than me learned over many years that if you heat and cool metal at specific temperatures and speeds, that you can actually cause the metal to become incredibly strong or incredibly brittle. So instruments are heated up to about 1500 degrees and then cooled in specific sequences that allow it to become very strong and hard. Now, the next step for surgical instruments is called polishing. Polishing can produce like a satin-like finish, or it can be much more intensive and be a mirror-like finish. The mirror finish actually does the best job of protecting the instrument from things like corrosion and staining. But the problem with mirroring is that now it becomes a big reflector of light, which can be really difficult under surgical lights with the intensity of the light shining down. That could be a very difficult process when you're in the wound trying to work, which is why a lot of instruments undergo the satin process, which isn't quite as protective. It is still very protective. It's not as protected as the mirror finish, but it reflects much less light, making it much easier to work with within the surgical wound. It's really up to the end user on which finish you want on your surgical instruments. Now, the next step is very important, and it's called passivation. This next step actually dips the surgical instruments into nitric acid, which completely changes the outer layer of the instrument and removes the iron atoms that are on it. And those iron atoms would ultimately be the things leading to corrosion. Besides removing the iron atoms, chromium oxide is deposited, which is the protective layer preventing corrosion of the instrument. And the last step in the process is marking the instrument. This could be anywhere from just marking the manufacturer name, such as Aesculap or V. Mueller, whatever that is, or it could also be that extra step where they actually apply the RFID markings as well, those square little barcodes you'll see on like Aesculap instruments, for instance. And then eventually this instrument is packaged up and sent to whoever purchases that instrument. It's a pretty simple process from the outside looking in, but it's only because of very, very smart people that figured out how to work with metal over a long period of time and created these very specific, intense little instruments that we can use to work in surgery and save lives. And that, my friends, is where surgical instruments come from. Any topics or videos you want to see, please put them in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I love you guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.